Hi everybody, I'm Samantha Allinger with FedScoop TV. I'm here at the 2016 Red Hat Government Symposium, and I'm talking to John Keese, Director of Government Cloud Services at CSRA. John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
So my first question for you is kind of looking back at this administration, what strides have we really made in open data and, open source, and what progress could be made in the future?
Sure. So you're referring to the current administration?
Yes.
Yeah. So my history is we've been at the open source game for a long time Red Hat partner, but our adoption around open source dates back at least 6 or 7 years, which is, those are dog years in open source. So we did a lot of work with bringing a lot of the California-based companies into the federal marketplace that were essentially startups at the time, but were open source in nature, most of it entitled, and getting them into schedules, which allowed them to effectively be purchased by the federal government. But predating that, some of the work that I've seen and I've been involved with, I worked a long time with the Open Source Software Institute, which I think has changed names since then. But at that time, we were working just to make sure that open source, the language of open source, wasn't precluded in contractual agreements. In other words, there was a lot of movement at the time by proprietary type technology, which is very prudent and relevant in certain cases, but should not have precluded open source, to actually change the language. And it started with Karen Evans, who I think was the CIO of DoD at the time. So moving from there, certainly the cloud first policy is often talked about, and that has been an advent for open source that's been unprecedented, because when we look at specifically cloud technologies, the underpinnings of most cloud infrastructure to some extent, or to a great extent, is open source in nature. So when that policy came out, I remember some of the headlines. It was Vivek Kunjar saying their intention was to break the IT cartel that was the Beltway, right? And that cartel essentially was predominantly proprietary in nature. So cloud has certainly been very disruptive, and with that disruption, it dragged along open source. And in the paradigms of when you look at AWS, if you look at the CSRA cloud specifically, we're very open source in our nature, and has allowed us to bring price points and cost points to the federal government and agencies that want to procure those services. And just to further to that, some of the mindset that got changed then was when predating the acquisition of Autonomic, which is the company that I had by CSRA, in talking with some of the large SIs when I was a smaller cloud vendor, it was kind of the slap on the back, isn't that cute? We like it just the way it is, and good luck with that cloud stuff, to everything from, well, cloud might work in the civilian agencies, but it's never going to be in the Department of Defense. And look how far we've come. And I believe that's the administrative work. This administration has done a lot with whether intentionally or not, really was the advent in the opening of open source technologies use within the federal government.
The DoD has definitely changed a lot with respect to their opinions on cloud and how they want to use cloud.
They certainly have, and certainly, as you might expect, both in the intelligence communities and the Department of Defense, or some of our three-letter organizations in the U.S. government, are rightly concerned with security, and I've seen our effectiveness in being able to be one of the FedRAMP high baseline awardees or accreditation clouds is the reason that we've been able to move through so many accreditations. We were the first ones through the FedRAMP process, and one of the first 3 high baselines. The reason that we attribute to that is certainly remarkable people, but certainly the use of open source has allowed us to be very flexible in managing these multitudes of NIST controls, somewhere north of 420 to implement and enhance. And we strongly believe that we wouldn't have been able to achieve that rapid accreditation and multiple accreditations in this space without having open platforms. So, simply put, if we were stovepiped or if we were locked in and vendor locked with proprietary solutions in the entirety of our cloud, then I don't think that we would have had that. And I believe what we've seen is the FedRAMP office take quite a bit of heat at times about how long and slow the process was. And I would bet that a lot of that complaint came from vendors who were trying to take a proprietary solution that wasn't open in nature and make it adaptable to all these security controls. So, and I think what we have seen, certainly CSRA we believe is in very good position to work with DISA and the MilCloud 2.0, and a lot of that will be oriented around open source technology. So, yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. And that was definitely, right into my second question, which was going to be, how do you think open source can really facilitate cybersecurity and, agencies having secure systems? Do you have more to add to that, or, more in a general sense, how you think?
Yeah, I believe so. Cybersecurity is often used as a term, and I think it's often understood, right? So the posture of our collective customers' environments, the security posture around those, hence cybersecurity, is really based around a discipline around the implementation of these NIST security controls. That those baselines are baselines for a purpose, and hence in fact, we use, and we know that, for instance, AWS, and I'm sure to some degree Microsoft, they are all using some components of open source to meet the cybersecurity requirements that people are looking to have done. So we used to have a mindset, if we build hard perimeters and we don't let anything in or out, that makes it secure. But obviously we're a connected world. Even Department of Defense or IC, they still need to be connected with each other within their own enclaves. And the open source community tends to solve its own problems. Certainly, Paul Smith's comments, I believe he indicated, if for instance Red Hat didn't take the contributions to Linux and put it into a entitled bucket and supported, who would? And then there's a majority of these highly secure environments that really count on Linux and SE Linux as the core foundation of their security. And that, in fact, is where you build all your cybersecurity up from, right? So it's been an interesting journey for sure. One aside is, talking about the advent of open source as it relates to security and or just the adoption of open source. There was a C-level individual that I got connected to on a phone call that worked for a proprietary vendor, and it wasn't too long ago, and carried the letters of CTO. And when they asked me what hypervisor I ran, I said KVM, and they responded, "I don't know what that is." So that we've come a long way. Yeah.
Definitely. And turning to something kind of related to cybersecurity, making sure you have secure systems, IT modernization, and the necessity to modernize. IT modernization's legislation's making its way through Congress. It's been a big subject of discussion. In particular, Tony Scott has emphasized it a lot in his recent conversations, recent talks. As agencies look to modernize their systems in the near future, how can open source facilitate that or kind of help that along?
Sure. And usually my responses are usually centered around security. So because that's kind of what we live and breathe at CSRA. But from that standpoint, in this particular symposium, and in all probably going forward, you're going to hear all this content about containerized technology, right? So, and the goodness that containerized technology brings. So we happen to subscribe to OpenShift, which is origin upstream in the community, and orchestration through Kubernetes and source control through Jenkins. But the reason that I'm bringing that up is an emboldening of our security posture overall for agencies and our customers is that when you build a top of those platforms and you're building from a platform that has gone through this rigor of accreditation or cybersecurity controls, the FedRAMP process, for instance, or the DoD's security requirements guidelines. When agencies build and move their applications containerized into these platforms as a service, if you will, the security inheritance from those controls is significantly high. Somewhere upwards, I mentioned in the high baseline, there's about 420 security controls that you have to meet. When agencies build on top of that, they're getting about an 80% to an 85% security control inheritance. What that means, simply put, is that traditionally systems were built bare metal or virtualized environments, and then you added your operating systems, your applications to the top of that. Each one of those steps required that each of the steps and the people that were implementing those were applying those security controls to protect those systems. In the PaaS environment, that function is essentially automated, and those security controls are inherited. So really what agencies get to do is what they want to do is meet mission and allow their software developers to code on top of that and not worry about all the underlying infrastructure and control processes that need to be in place. The further step to that would be in the questions that we get today for people who are considering or adopting containerized technology, which is to the point where it becomes secure but highly efficient, is that container trusted, right? So I think that will be a burdening of the ecosystem that will adopt to address those problems. Certainly, Red Hat does that with their entitlement. They have that relationship with Black Duck. You have Docker Data Center that does trusted container-type technologies, and we're seeing an emergence of that. So really what that means is that then even the code of those cartridges can further strengthen the security posture because there's even more trust. So really, I think we're not getting to a panacea, but we're making the adoption of containers and platform as a service technologies is going to move the needle from a surety standpoint by leaps and bounds, in my opinion.
Great.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about other things that can maybe benefit from utilizing more open source in government, some things that just came to mind, collaboration, mobility, speed might be helped along by open source.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Those will all be in parallel or lockstep with that. So where we've been and where we are and where we're going, certainly from our standpoint, not to be selfish in the interview, but we're adding, in that PaaS environment, we're adding a mobility platform, right? Again, open source origins, it's Red Hat oriented in this case, and again, mobility will be a platform that will, the term, IoT, I don't always understand what the Internet of Things means. It tends to be a compliant buzzword that's said, but certainly the delivery of government systems into the field, into the hands of everybody that needs to operate the environments or work with their mission applications to get to every device. We see open source playing a large role in the ability to mobilize the workforce and to bring the applications to whatever device the user has a preference for, and not be so locked into certain things that were secure at one time. We think of BlackBerries were extremely efficient. They served a large purpose, but then that platform's changed. We have Android and iOS, and we have tablets. So mobility is becoming largely, it's been considered. I don't know that we've seen a large adoption, but I think open source is going to put a lot of providers in a position to answer those type of requirements when they really start to come out. But I think it's a wait and see to some degree. And again, even there, how do you trust your mobile applications? And I think open source is going to start to address that marketplace as well. In terms of collaboration, there have been a number. I'm not as closely tied to collaborative platforms. I certainly think of Jive and things of that nature that have been there and have their roots in open source. But I would also venture a guess that probably within, I'm guessing that to some degree the LDAP systems or the directory services that that the government has used and depended on for so many years will eventually start to find their roots in open source as well, and that's huge because directory services tend to be a binding component of a lot of application environments within the government that hinge on proprietary type software, and I believe that will be a market, although very challenging, will be addressed over time by the open source community as well.
Great. Well, I think that's all we have time for today.
Okay,
but
very good.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the time.
Thanks. And I'm Samantha Allinger with FedScoop TV. Thanks for watching.